this episode of Minds Between Languages, we talk to Gary Massey, who was, until recently, Professor of Translation Studies at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences in Switzerland. Welcome to Minds Between Languages. I'm very happy that in this episode I'm joined by Gary Massey. Hello, Gary.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us.
I'm very pleased to be here.
You have had a fruitful career, not only as a translation scholar and teacher, but you have also had the opportunity to be involved in the administrative side of translator education as the director of the Institute of Translation and Interpreting and former head of Zurich University of Applied Sciences MA and BA programs in translation and applied languages. And you were also deputy dean of the School of Applied Linguistics, of which your institute formed a part. So what I'd be interested in particular at the beginning of this episode would be your take on the socio-cognitive processes at this level of a translator training institution and how your research focus on processes rather than only products has informed your approach to the management of these programs.
So that's thank you very much. I kind of slipped into the administrative side of things and then found I couldn't get out again. Although, you know, it does give you a peculiarly interesting perspective on the way education runs, basically. And perhaps that's where I could start, really, because I was a researcher and an administrator. I started with teaching and research and then became increasingly an administrator. And I was able to meld the two. And it gave me a peculiar opportunity to be able to shape the way in which programs were developed and also institutions. I'll come to that in a second. But to answer your question, well, in the workplace and the lab research that I was doing, a great deal of which you've already, in one of your interviews, covered. The interview was with Maureen Ehrensberger-Dow, a very dear and close colleague with whom I worked and on various projects. Well, especially the ErgoTrans project. The workplace and the lab research we did uncovered a good deal about socio-cognitive processes that are actually engaged when professionals and students perform competently, but also less competently. And when we were looking at these processes in that project, we saw directly the impact of what was then referred to as situatedness, using Hannah Risku's term. Physical factors obviously related to embodiment, environmental factors that were related to embeddedness, and socio-technical factors, in other words, the humans and the artifacts of distributed cognition, or what's now called extended cognition. So we saw this impact on the way people were working. Now, what we also saw was by comparing translators at various levels of experience, we were able to identify indicators of the way translator and translation competence is most likely to develop and develop well. In a nutshell, it seemed to be a combination of product-oriented deliberate practice with feedback and the mechanisms involved there, and process-oriented reflection and metacognition. Now, this is a long way in which I'm trying to answer your question, but if you bear with me, the point is that fundamental to that development appears to be enactment in the form of experience and experiential learning. And that may or may not be widely known, is actually modeled in a cycle or a spiral developed by a chap called Kolb in 1984, and there's a second edition in 2015 of his work. And this is basically an iterative process in which concrete experience is followed by reflective observation on that experience, then an abstract conceptualization to learn from that experience, and then active experimentation to try out what has been learned. So we've got this cycle going on, and that seemed to underlie a lot of what we were seeing in the work we were doing. But of course, all affected by these external factors, these contextual factors, so on and so forth. Now, interestingly, those insights seem to dovetail very closely with organizational learning models. Now, I'd become familiar with those models through my managerial duties. We were often sent on courses. We have to do kind of imagine as managers at our institution. And I got very interested in organizational learning as a result. Models by Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen, for instance, or Zenger or Smith. And those models use different terminology, but ultimately they follow the same 4-stage cycle. Discovery of a concrete problem, usually in organizations, then invention to develop a solution to that problem, the production, which is the implementation of the solution, and then a generalization, which is the conceptualization that derives from what you have seen happening during the implementation, and then back to problem solving, so on and so forth. Now, given the origins of organizational learning in action research theory, and it does come from that, the models can be mapped fully onto that spiral. Now, that was very convenient for me and my colleagues because it provided a very ready model for collaborative development between students and staff. In other words, the cycle of observation, planning, acting and reflecting, observing, planning, acting, reflecting. Now, this is fundamental to teaching practice in many disciplines. Strangely enough, not so much in translation. We don't see action research being actively engaged in.
Or not so much at such a level that all the teaching staff and the students are involved as you seem to have had in your experience.
It's a very interesting point, really, because I mean, the mechanisms are there, but they normally are placed at a level way beyond that of an individual department or a program or a staff unit or what have you. And then you have kind of these generalized ideas of staff development and these workshops that are kind of offered. And they're more or less divorced from the reality of the teaching and the interactions with the students that the teachers have. So basically, you will send a teacher. Teachers will classically learn about teaching by going to workshops about teaching. But why not learn a little bit more about teaching by researching your own teaching yourself? That was the basic idea. And also, in so doing, perhaps bridging the divide between the practitioners on our program who had no idea of theory or research and the researchers who needed much more input on their own teaching. So basically, it was a win-win situation. And you know Don Corrali as I do. I know him fairly well. And this modeling that I was looking at, combined with the insights we were getting from this kind of workplace-based research we were doing, led me to his model of his co-emergent model, you know, the vortex model that Anthony Pym rather unkindly called a tooth. And that vortex model is very interesting because basically, if you take a top view of the vortex that he's talking about, you have exactly those cycles that I've just been describing. But of course, the decisive thing is the so-called affordances that support that learning in that learning environment. And so that was up to me. And how did I do it? Well, basically, I did it by introducing, together with my team, of course, everything is collaborative. Well, the first thing we did was to, at the teaching level, introduce process-oriented learning within the narrower confines of curriculum development. Our students would look at their own processes and that had been recorded or described or observed and so on and so forth. They would observe those of others, and that would help in the teaching of how translation is done, as it were. But it also helped the teachers identify problems that the students had that they wouldn't have normally seen when they were correcting the products alone. It's much easier to have a look at what's going on as well, as a supplement, not as a replacement, but as a supplement to the product-oriented quality evaluation we have, of course, and I wouldn't want to challenge that in translation studies and translator education. And then, of course, the other level, after the student level, comes the teacher level. And I had the privilege of being able to issue a continuing professional development directive, which offered incentives to foster this type of experiential development in the form of action research, low threshold action research while this was going on, while this process-oriented teaching was going on, the teachers themselves would try and would ask themselves, I mean, what am I learning from this? And what are my students learning from this? And how can we improve this? Not just in process-oriented teaching and learning, of course, also in other scenarios. But this action research cycle, I find basically it was very, very low cost, low threshold. It wasn't taken up by everybody, but the opportunity was there for everybody, and that helped. Yeah, it was incentivized.
Issue, right, for translator training or translator education, should I say? Because I know that also in some of your articles, including those with Donald Kirali, you wrote about the distinction between translator training, translator education. But could you comment on that, please?
It's perhaps controversial to some. Some wouldn't see this, but I mean, as you said, in common with Don, you know, basically training for us was relatively straightforward action of getting students to adopt a set of routines that can then be quickly automatized. And education was a much more holistic approach that was aimed at kind of getting empowering the students to inhabit a set of roles that weren't necessarily always defined. The idea being that we give them what Eric Angeloni has called adaptive expertise, so that they can be prepared to perform fairly unpredictable future activities that will come up during their professional lives. If you're trained, there's nothing against training, but if you're trained, you basically acquire the skills to work with tools that are currently available. How can you work with tools that aren't available? They're currently available. And the routines are specified or easily predictable. But you can't really be trained, in inverted commas, for a market which in a few years from now is going to use completely different tools and have different work processes. And how are you going to face these unfamiliar tasks and solve unforeseen problems through training? You can't really be trained to do that. You can be sensitized to the problems.
But that's already education and not just
that's where the education
training
comes in.
Exactly. Not only tools, I think, which we have seen rapidly evolving, but also different roles that translators increasingly play. So we can't cover them all in a 1 year or 2 year program, or even if it's 4 or 5 year program, you can't cover everything that they will encounter.
Nor is it important to, I don't think. I think what we need is an educational commitment. I mean, we've got the training, which is obviously going to be there. Don't get me wrong, that is part of it. But
of course,
the overarching concept should be an education, which is a commitment for me to generic holistic competencies, which obviously specific training has a definite place in this, but it's not superordinate to it. The education is there, and within it we have training for today's market, but ultimately that's not the point of the education. The fulcrum of translator education is, in my view, holistic, it's experiential, it's collaborative, and it's what we would call co-emergent. It involves engagement with the context in which you work. It's not basically just putting your head down and following a set of routines. Because
you don't just, as a learner, follow instructions and so on, but you also change the environment in which you will, which you are learning, and also later in which you will be working, because our students go on to become professionals, and then they enact some changes in the profession, hopefully for the better, rather than just following the usual norms and practices. At least that's something that I feel is important.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I agree totally, absolutely. Yeah. In a sense, though, if you think about it, I mean, it's going off on a bit of a tangent here, but we'll come back. It's having the confidence to do that, though, isn't it? This is the point. What I've noticed, and it's a little bit anecdotal, of course, as all experiences, and it's something that a lot of my colleagues have been talking about, but the type of students we were getting and have been getting, possibly because of the nature of what they conceptualize translation is, seemed to have very low self-efficacy, very, very low confidence, very low concept of their own possible potential agency. And I think even something as simple as, actually asserting yourself and rearranging your workplace. If you work for a company, of course, you need confidence to do that. You need to say, I want this rather than this. Don't just give me the standard stuff. Oh, and by the way, I don't think that the acquisition of that tool was very bright. That type of input, I think organizations definitely need from the people who are working with the languages and know the languages. This is the point. We know much more about that than a manager who's just parachuted in from cigarette selling.
Exactly, sometimes exactly that.
Exactly, yeah.
And this is then education rather than just training, right?
I think it is. I'll come to it later, but I think there is a definite movement. We've seen it in competence models over the years, where so-called soft skills. I think that's a terrible word, soft skills, because it automatically says they're less important than hard skills. But the soft skills become increasingly important. I prefer the word transferable skills.
Yes.
Simply because that is central, and they are becoming increasingly important. I mean, we can see it actually literally modeled that way in competence profiles.
Yes. And also students are unaware that they possess them after graduating. They somehow have to be, I think, as you said, sensitized or made aware that a lot of the things that we do as part of translator training or education, that is actually transferable to other areas as well, because they may end up working in completely different areas, but they have learned to do problem solving and negotiating and all of these things.
This is it. This is precisely it. This is absolutely key. You get the complaint, don't you, that well, I did, perhaps you didn't, that certain students don't see the efficacy of group work. They find that onerous. They prefer to do it all on their own and so on. What they don't realize is that the group work is not about turning in a translation. The group work, or well, perhaps not only about that, but it's also about the way in which you get there. That is all part of the game. They don't see that. They're narrowly focused on translation as an act, a cognitive act, I think. Whereas, I mean, I love this image. Again, Andrew Chesterman provided it, as opposed to the event of translation. It's not an act, it's an event. Really.
It's an event, yes, exactly. And such a complex event it is, isn't
Absolutely. Unbelievably complex.
So we need complex models, theoretical models as well to understand it. And I think that the second generation or latest generation of cognitive science has provided such approach, the 4EA cognition model. So it has sort of entered translation studies through the work of Hannah Risko and your own and some others. But I still feel that it's a little bit unknown, and that maybe we need to clarify what exactly these letters stand for and what the words mean, and what kind of model or approach it is. So if you could clarify it a little bit in general first.
Okay, I mean, yes, there's a lot to say. You just stop me if I'm saying too much, but basically, 4EA cognition, as you said, second generation cognitive science. And it's basically a recognition that cognition doesn't just take place there in the cranium, but that it is part of the world in which we are embedded as embodied beings. So basically, let's untie these 4 E's and the A. The 4 E's stand for embodied, embedded, extended, and inactive. Some people use the past participle enacted. The A stands for effective, emotional. People are getting more interested. I found it very fascinating that quite recently Doug Robinson, who's not really, I mean, he's a very, very great writer from our field, has been looking at it. And he's looked at it historically, and he says, and he very cogently argues that this is more or less directly coming from hermeneutic philosophy, Schleiermacher, Herder, Dilthey, via phenomenology. That's interesting, simply because, again, it shows that it's a rather kind of individually based interpretational view of the world, and a phenomenological one at the same time, one that's based on my understanding of the world as a being in the world. So I suppose that 4EA's basic premise is that cognition, the mental processes of acquiring knowledge and understanding, and that obviously includes learning, doesn't occur, as I said, in the head, but is extracranial as well as intracranial. So let's untie these words like embodied. Cognition is embodied in the sense that it is within our senses and part of our lived physical reality. The idea is that cognition can't be fully described in terms of abstract mental processes, but must involve the entire body of our organism, our living organism. It's embedded in a physical, a cultural, a social, and a technical context. It's not just an isolated act, as I said, the act of translation, but it is decisively interwoven with the agent's environment. It is co-determined, really, with the physical, the social, and cultural aspects of the world. It's extended because it's extended across tools, devices, technologies. I mean, for instance, we all use books. I mean, it's not that everything is in my head. I am using books, or write something down on a piece of paper or on a computer.
Oh, today, all the more technological than in the past, but it has always been extended,
it's
right?
Always been extended. It's always been extended. Well, I presume there was a point at which memory played a decisive role. I have no idea about pre-Socratic philosophy, but I assume that there were before writing was widespread, then there was another means of capturing knowledge.
It was probably extended at that time as well, because there were individuals in a community that were memory keepers for that community. So it was extended in that sense as well, I think.
Really interesting point. That's really interesting point, because it's not just the tools, it's the other human collaborators in the process of working. For instance, when we're learning and we're working with collaborators, we're working with other students. And that's absolutely vital that they are sources of knowledge. Of cognition as well. And it's good that you've said that. Again, going on the side, I said earlier, I had a kind of literary basis to my education prior to moving into translation studies. If you think about it, yes, how was literature conveyed in the in the Middle Ages, for instance, where literacy rates were exceedingly low? Well, you had bards coming around.
Yeah. Exactly.
Singing mnemonically oriented ballads, the rhythms were the result of the mnemonics involved there, and telling stories, basically.
And today you perhaps, as a translator, you have that one colleague who has studied medicine and who is now working as a medical expert, whom you always ask for these difficult medical terms.
Absolutely perfect. Or a wife who works at the Court of Justice. So if you've got you have problems with law, you can turn to her.
Exactly. So
my personal experience.
Be careful who you marry. It's useful if it's an expert in something that you're translating.
Absolutely.
But anyway, we digress. I think you still have
enacted to go. Enacted, and the enactment part is the experiential part I was talking about. Cognition is enacted. Cognition has to be worked through, or enactive has to be worked through. There have to be actions involved. There have to be goal-oriented movements involved, and this is where cognition comes in at the experiential side. We learn through experience and experiential actions in achieving our goals, in solving problems, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, the primacy of experience, as I've already said, becomes especially relevant to the particular embedded setting of a learning or teaching organization. For instance, how one learns at a university.
Yes.
Now, the affective element is the one we haven't talked about, and the affective dimension is a bit more complex. It's kind of added on. I mean, a long time people were talking about 4E cognition, and then the A appeared. I'm not denigrating it at all. I think it's absolutely vital, but it has a kind of transversal effect here. It doesn't really fit this the more or less clear categorization of embodied and so on and so forth. But it looks at the way emotion influences enactment, or impacts on extended cognitive interactions, or engenders responses to contexts and lived reality. And then again, it shows how emotions themselves are conditioned by these 4 E's in return. So it's one of these It's almost in the interstices between the points of the 4 E's, I think. Now, I'm by no means an expert on this, but if you're really interested in pursuing this, of course, very interesting work on the cognitive side is being done by my former colleague Caroline Lehr, by Severin Hupsche-Davidson, whom you know, of course, who's working over in the UK now, and Christian Dansgaard-Velplund. So it's interesting, again, to see that how very progressively emotional intelligence as well have been entering into workplace studies of the way translators work in their environments, and also how learners learn, of course. As I've already mentioned, our ergonomic research will present some obvious examples of how cognitive performance is not solely a function of what takes place in the head, but is the result of enactment by embodied beings who are embedded in extended socio-technical networks that have strong affective dimensions. So we've traced, for instance, distractors and stressors, embodied ones. For instance, posture is a classic example of the way in which stressors and distractors affect cognition in the embodied side. We've got embedded distractors, factors, ambient noise, temperature, workplace design, organizational decision-making. We've got tool issues, colleagues' behavior in the extended side. Now, all of these have had what we have observed to be detrimental effects on the enactment and on the emotional responses, including the motivation of people, which will then have reciprocal feedback effects on enactment and, of course, ultimately performance. This is the point. To perform competently, your cognition is not just, as I said, that of an individual sitting there performing an act of translation. There are so many factors intervening, shaping, affecting, influencing, undermining, or promoting that cognition that have to be taken into account. That's my view, anyway.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely. This is very fascinating. And I think we do need such complex models in order to understand translation from the various points of view and how it actually happens. One of the other things that you have studied recently is, in particular, embodiment with respect to the use of technology or technology itself as being disembodied, actually. So the difference between human translators and machine or automatic translators might be one in embodiment or lack thereof.
Yes. It's really interesting. I mean, the word disembodied has been used, actually, disembodiment and disembodied cognition, as with reference to what AI does. You see, because AI, I mean, you know about AI, which I don't know much about. My son knows loads about it, so he told me. In robotics development, there is a serious move to consider the issue of embodiment, literally creating robots' bodies, you know, so they can respond. But the tools that we're looking at in translation remain what might be described as disembodied intelligence, disembodied cognition. Now, the term itself is used by a very, very influential educational theorist and AI specialist. Well, one of two brothers, Stuart Dreyfus. The Dreyfus model, I'll come back to in a second, but that's been used a lot in adult skills acquisition, and there's also been something of a means by which the discourse of AI versus human value added, or the human expertise, has been instantiated and kicked off. I'll come back to that in a second as well. But Stuart Dreyfus talked about this back in 2004 when he was actually discussing his and his brother's influential model. Basically, what he's saying is, Dreyfus is saying, is that situational experience-based know-how in his particular model, which is best expressed through concepts of embodiment at the 3 higher stages. I won't go into the details, but he says this is closely associated with embodiment at the higher stages of the model's development, competence, proficiency, and expertise. Now, this is completely different from disembodied artificial intelligence, simply because, of course, machines do not have experience, as it were, in the way that we understand it. Now, the Dreyfus model broadly squares with key finding from expertise research and Fourier models. The claim is that embodied experience endows human cognition with a progressive, goal-oriented involvement, with the ability to judge and discriminate between certain situations, and the mental adaptivity needed to approach expertly or competently new problems and new tasks. And that can apply to translation, that can apply to nursing, that can apply to driving, what have you. This is where the research I was doing came in, because there has been, I would call it feverish discourse surrounding AI and the human added value of translators. And it was that prompted me to build on work I'd already done with Maureen Ellensberger et al. And look at the way human translators and AI handle so-called conceptual metaphor. And how they handle it. And I was interested in looking at it not only from the point of view of the products, the end products, but also from the way in which the translators arrived at certain solutions. I can't go into the mind of AI because I don't think it has a mind. There are a few process-oriented studies on conceptual metaphor, but mostly the studies are reverse engineered, product-oriented studies. Now, why did I choose conceptual metaphor for this? Well, conceptual metaphor theory is basically born of embodiment, basically, or embodiment theory. What it sees is metaphor as a process of mapping from one domain of human experience to another, from a source domain to another domain, in order to understand abstract concepts. The mapping is a bit complicated, the theory, but the mapping is realized by means of surface expressions, metaphorical expressions, lexical form. In lexical form, words, basically metaphors as words. But decisively, the mapping itself draws on our embodied experiences of the world to create correspondences, exactly. You know, up is good, down is bad, for instance. But the future is ahead of us, the past is behind us, so on and so forth, all these points. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that, because there are distinctions made between primary metaphors, which are grounded in our everyday experience of the world, so-called ontological metaphors or directional metaphors and so on and so forth, or orientational metaphors, you know, up, down. And these primary metaphors have to do with our senses, our sensory experience of the world. The way in which
is something that AI doesn't have, right?
It doesn't have that.
So it can translate metaphor if it has seen something before in the training data. It can maybe even be creative about it, but it does not have this component that makes human process of metaphor creating possible, right?
Precisely, especially because it doesn't have cultures. It doesn't have and this is the second layer, because there are not only primary metaphors, but these primary metaphors can be combined into what are called complex metaphors by certain cultures. So you'll see then cultural differentiating begin, because of course, if we just accept conceptual metaphor theory in its entirety on the primary level, of course, we will then say, well, I mean, basically everybody then has exactly the same metaphors the world over. No, it's not true. Simply because there will be various combinations according to the various cultures that have developed within certain contexts. That's where the translator comes in, precisely. And that's what I wanted to look at. And that's why I thought, well, this would be quite good, because, you know, what we've got is, you know, if I'm going to claim that embodied intelligence or embodied cognition, humans have an added value over that of machines, I've got to show it somewhere. We can't just say it. Because often, what then happens is that often the problem is that if we work then in a product-oriented way, what we're seeing is, all right, the product is more or less the same, so the AI is working in the same way. No, it's not. It's the way we get to that end.
Okay, we're running out of time here.
I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. This, I think we can take this up in another episode when you join us again. But on this note, I think we will have to end this episode. And I thank you very much, Gary, for the most interesting insights into cognition in translation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.